the importance of telling you this story for tonight is not so much in the conflict, but it's the response that Abraham gives. On the threat of physical violence by his own father, Abraham does not respond in kind. He doesn't strike out at his father. He doesn't, ask him to leave. He doesn't even condemn his father. He says, "O Father, peace be upon you. I will ask my Lord to forgive you." And then later on in the same section, he actually asks his Lord to forgive his father's idolatry. Abraham's attitude to the threat from his father and his community should make us reflect on how the friend of God, that's how Abraham is called, the Khalilullah in Islam, reacted to those he disagreed with. It should make us pause and reflect about the Abrahamic approach to disagreement. The Abrahamic standard can be useful for purposes of interfaith dialogue as well. Its approach is consistent with the revelation taught to the Prophet Muhammad in chapter 29, verse 46, where God says to the Prophet, "Do not argue with the people of the book," i.e. Christians and Jews, "other than in the most kindliest of manner, and say to them, we believe that which has been bestowed upon high to us is the same as to you. For our God and your God is one and the same, and unto him we all surrender." This notion of tolerance and loving towards other people as an attribute of God reflected in the Abrahamic tradition is found in the essence of a human being's relationship to God, which is based on loyalty, nobility, and altruism. It is love that is unconditional. Now, this idea is reflected in the Quran in many verses where God says he loves those who are the sabirun, the patient, the steadfast, or those who are muhsin, those who are good, those who are sincere. This notion, then, of being loving, and in particular of loving God and his creation, can be found in many aspects of Islamic teachings, but particularly it led to the notion of spiritual chivalry, culminating in the Sufi orders that began in the late 12th century. Indeed, the great Sufi theologian Al-Ghazali, who lived in the early 12th century, incorporated the concept of divine love as a means where one eradicates one's base desires and replaces it with loving God. He says, the perfection of love occurs when not even anger, hatred, or harm he might receive can keep him from goodness and altruism. This is reflected about 150 years later in the poetry and writings of Jalaluddin Rumi, the great scholar and poet of the 13th century, who sums up the value of love in several couplets. He says, "Through love, all this bitter will be sweet. Through love, all that is copper will be gold. Through love, all silt will be turned to purest wine." Of course, he means that metaphorically. "Through love, all pain will turn to medicine. Through love, the dead will become alive. Through love, the king does not turn into a slave." With this sort of foundational background, we are ready to understand the role of the family in Islam. And indeed, it can be summed up in two concepts. One, a social construct. In other words, through what we call the traditional notions of marriage. And second is affinity of people through kinship or blood. The structure of the family in Islam is rooted in the Quran, which refers to several examples of families, including, as I mentioned before, Adam and Eve, Noah's family, Abraham's family, and the family, of course, of Mary. These prophetic families serve as the prototype of the traditional family in Islam. As I mentioned, the preservation of the traditional family is one of the higher objectives of the Sharia. And this concept of the family has emerged as the product of both divine guidance and human efforts. Some of the essential components of the family consist of marriage, parenting, parents-children relationship, sibling relationship, and of course, the extended family. From a societal perspective, then, marriage serves as the focal point of the family. All of the prophets belonged to some form of family or another. Indeed, most of them were married, not all. But with respect to this kind of family relationship as it regards a husband and a wife, the Prophet Muhammad said, the believers who possess perfect faith, are those who display the best manners, or adab, and the best among you are those who treat your wives the best way. This notion of marriage can really be summed up in a metaphor of what's called a covering or a cloth, which is in Arabic called labas. Now the Quran uses this term to describe the relationship between husbands and wives, and it says, you are a garment or labas for them, and they are a garment for you. This comes from the root of labasa, which means to cover and protect. And this metaphor represents exquisite beauty, expressive of close intimacy, mutual comfort, and respect of one's secrets. And finally, mutual consolation in difficult times. In other words, after marriage, a couple ceases to belong to themselves, but now they belong to one another, sharing each other's joys, sorrows, glories, and faults. In other words, marriage is an opportunity to sow the seeds of love, which can develop into a strong branch of love and affection. The important point I want to emphasize here is also the notion of the sacredness of marriage. Marriage is viewed as sacred because it is a multifaceted relationship that is mutually accepted and realized by the married couple in the name of God and his religion. Now, I want to make one distinction. Unlike Catholicism, it's not a sacrament in the sense that divorce takes place in Islam. However, for the prophetic traditions, we know while divorce is permissible, it is deemed to be abhorrent. So that's why it's considered still a very sacred institution from a societal perspective to maintain. But if something goes wrong between the couple, then they do have, of course, options. Now, in addition, one of the other purposes of marriage is, of course, to produce children and to produce a family. And the family serves as a social agent to sustain progeny. And of course, this is another objective of Sharia. This is summed up very eloquently by one of the contemporary thinkers in Islam, Fethullah Gulen, who says, the soundest foundation for a nation is a family in which material and spiritual happiness flows. For such a family serves as a sacred institution that raises virtuous individuals. If a nation can make its home as enlightened and prosperous as its institutions of learning and business, and its institutions as warm as its homes, it has made the greatest reform and has guaranteed contentment and happiness for future generations. So from the foregoing, we can deduce that the fundamental religious role of the family is to create a human environment conducive to spiritual and moral education for both individuals in the form of self-improvement, character development, and for a collective success in society. Family members are a help to one another in the attainment of salvation through living an individual and collective life based on Islamic, ethical, and moral teachings. Now, in conclusion, I do want to highlight, of course, some of the issues that we face as members of the global family, not just the Islamic family, but families from all various religious and traditions. And this is in particularly those of us who come from what I call a traditional family. And this, of course, is the problem of societal change and evolution. Change in both evolutionary effect in terms of society, but also in terms of the movement of people, in terms of migrations and immigration, and so forth. Now, change, of course, is unavoidable. But what is unique about today is the pace of change, along with the fundamental challenges to the basic assumptions of life, and in particularly the role of the traditional family today. For example, gone are the societal patterns that we saw in television shows such as Leave It to Beaver, Father Knows Best. I hope some of you still remember those shows. And my personal favorite, The Brady Bunch, which I guess shows you my age as well. You know, let me just digress for a second. I just think it's still fascinating that in the Brady Bunch you had 3 kids living in one room. I just don't think that works anymore, but it was fascinating that that took place in a particular period in our history. Now, these shows have been replaced with Desperate Housewives, The Bachelor, Jersey Shore, and Temptation Island. What's a parent to do? Now, this dramatic alteration of how Americans and other people view the concept of family, including marriage, divorce, relationship between parents and children, the role of women in the public sphere, and sexual relations, can only be described as a transformative moment in the history of our society. Legally speaking, the development of no-fault divorce, along with recent passage of legislation granting gay marriage or civil unions, has forced religious communities to address and question many assumptions of some of the fundamental bases of how we live as human beings. Religious communities, however, should play active roles in both public and private discussions about these dramatic changes and the family. Religious leaders need to challenge their congregations to discuss these issues and try to establish sound and healthy family relationships by engaging in public discourses on issues involving the family, ethics, and morality. Now, this does not mean that churches, synagogues, and mosques and their leaders should be vociferous participants in partisan politics. But religious individuals certainly have the right to participate in public policy debates, but they're better suited for assisting their congregations in curbing sex outside marriage or before marriage, limiting alcohol and drug use, and preventing domestic violence, as well as the recent rise in violent behavior by teenagers, and more importantly, reconnecting the role of the American family as the center of each community through incorporating the attributes of mercy and love. In forums such as these, Christians and Jews, together with Muslims, can play a much more positive role with respect to these issues I have previously highlighted. And serving as the bearers of ethical behavior and tradition, religious communities can serve as a bastion of hope with respect to the strengthening of the family and therefore in society in general. And with that, I thank you very much.